General Caldwell thought The Ghost was a Pentagon fairy tale, a JSOC bedtime story meant to keep the insurgency looking over their shoulders. He was wrong. When a buried artillery shell ripped his lead MRAP in half, and the valley erupted in crossfire, the general knew his convoy was dead, until the mountain itself started shooting back. This is the story of a myth, a female seal and a rifle barrel that ran so hot it blistered the skin. Riley Hollins smelled like stale ammonia and copper. It was the third day in the hide site, a miserable little crevice overlooking the Korengal-adjacent valley, and her body was eating itself. 3 days of rationing lukewarm water from a plastic bladder that tasted like melted tires. 3 days of pissing into a wide-mouth bottle while lying on her side, trying not to disturb the camouflage netting that blended her into the slate-grey rock. Her lower back was a tight, throbbing knot of inflamed muscle. She shifted just a fraction of an inch, and the gravel beneath her chest plate ground together. It sounded deafening in her own ears. Down in the valley, the heat waves shimmered off the hardpan dirt like cheap glass. Through the optics of her Mark 13 Mod 7 sniper rifle, the world was a distorted, magnified sliver of reality. Her right eye ached. A dull headache pulsed behind her temples, the kind born from constant squinting and dehydration. She wasn't a superhero. She was a mechanic of death, and right now she was just really, really tired. Overwatch, this is Romeo Actual. The radio earpiece crackled, breaking the heavy silence. The voice was thin, staticky. Convoy is entering the Western Corridor. ETA to your Sector 5 mics. Copy Romeo Actual, Riley whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. She cleared her throat, tasting dust. I have eyes on the corridor. It's quiet. Too quiet. 2 miles down the road, General Tiago Caldwell sat in the cramped, over-air-conditioned rear of an armoured Striker. He hated the Striker. It smelled of spilled diesel-stale sweat and the sour anxiety of the young infantryman sitting across from him. Caldwell was a man of logistics, of spreadsheets and strategic redeployments. He wore his stars heavy on his collar, but underneath the Kevlar, his shoulders sagged. General Captain Davis. His aide leaned over, raising his voice over the rumble of the massive diesel engine. Air support is grounded. Sandstorm moving in from the north. We just have the drone feed and... Davis hesitated, looking at a clipboard. The asset. Caldwell scoffed, rubbing a hand over his face. You mean this ghost bullshit? JSOC says she's in position, sir. JSOC says a lot of things, Captain. They tell me they put a female SEAL on that ridge, alone, unsupported, to babysit a heavy armor column. Caldwell shook his head, staring at the scarred metal floor. It's a morale psyop, a ghost story, to make the brass feel better about sending us through this toilet of a valley. If the Taliban hits us, one sniper isn't going to do a damn thing. Caldwell wasn't entirely wrong. One rifle couldn't stop an army. But Riley wasn't there to stop an army. She was there to break its spine. Up on the ridge, the wind shifted. It brought a new smell, not just dust, not just the baked sagebrush. Goat fat, unwashed wool, and the sharp chemical tang of gun oil. Riley stopped breathing for a second. Her heart gave a sudden heavy thump against her ribs. She didn't slowly pan her rifle. That was how you got spotted. She kept the weapon still and shifted her eye around the edges of the scope's field of view. Nothing but rocks. She blinked the sweat out of her eye. It stung. She reached up with a gloved hand and adjusted the magnification ring on her scope. The knurled metal was scalding hot to the touch. There, at 3 o'clock, about 800 yards down the ridge, slightly elevated above the valley floor. A shadow that didn't belong. Shadows in this desert were hard, sharp things cast by the sun. This shadow was soft. It moved. Through the glass the shapes resolved. 3 men. They were belly-crawling through the shale, dragging heavy olive-drab tubes. RPG-7s. Behind them, further up the slope, a glint of metal caught the sun. A PKM machine gun nest settling into a defilade. They were digging in, setting a classic L-shaped ambush. Riley thumbed the push-to-talk button on her chest rig. Romeo Actual, this is Overwatch. Be advised you have uninvited guests. Multiple hostile elements setting in on the northern ridge. Grid, static. A harsh electronic screech that felt like an ice pick in her ear. She winced, pulling the earpiece out slightly. Romeo Actual, acknowledge. Comms are jammed. Repeat, they are jamming comms. Nothing. The enemy wasn't just setting an ambush. They had electronic warfare capabilities. They had waited for the air support to be grounded by the weather, jammed the local frequencies, and now the convoy was driving blind into a meat grinder. Riley looked through her scope. The lead vehicle of Caldwell's convoy, a heavily up-armored MRAP, was just rounding the bend, its tires kicking up a massive plume of yellow dust. She was alone. No quick reaction force. No Apache helicopters. Just her bolt-action rifle and 50 rounds of .300 Winchester Magnum. Her hands started to shake. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the massive, sudden dump of adrenaline into her bloodstream. Her body preparing for violence. She forced herself to exhale a long, stuttering breath that ruffled the dust in front of her muzzle. "Okay, Hollins," she muttered to herself, her voice cracking. "Do the math." The explosion didn't sound like a movie. There was no fiery Hollywood fireball. It was a vicious flat crack that punched the air out of the valley. In the striker, Caldwell didn't even hear it. He just felt the world turn sideways. The shockwave hit the armored hull like a god's hammer. The heavy vehicle lurched violently to the left, throwing Caldwell against the steel plating. His helmet cracked against the roof, and suddenly his mouth tasted like old pennies. The lights died. Red emergency bulbs flickered on, casting a bloody glow over the cabin. The young infantryman across from him was screaming, clutching a broken collarbone. "IED, IED." Davis was yelling, stumbling over the tangled legs of the troops. "Lead MRAP is gone. We're stalled." Outside, the trap snapped shut. The PKM machine gun on the ridge opened up. It sounded like a giant canvas sail tearing in half. Heavy 7.6 2 by 54mm rounds began hammering the side of the striker. The metal groaned and pinged the concussions, ringing inside the cabin like a bell. Caldwell tasted dirt. He spat, trying to clear his head. He was a general. He hadn't fired his weapon in combat in 2 decades. But the sheer deafening volume of the ambush was primal. It bypassed the rank on his chest and triggered the animal instinct in his brain. Survival. Up on the ledge, Riley was already moving. The moment the IED detonated, a massive plume of black dirt and pulverized asphalt rising into the sky, she acquired her first target, the PKM gunner. He was silhouetted against the dust, hammering the stalled convoy. Distance 840 yards. Wind crosswind maybe 5 miles per hour, reading the mirage. Elevation minus 12 degrees. Her brain ran the ballistic calculator, but her body betrayed her. Her finger slipped on the trigger guard. She fumbled. Shit. She cursed internally, forcing her hand to steady. She wasn't a machine. She was a tired woman who desperately needed a glass of water. And right now she had to thread a needle through the wind to save 50 men she had never met. She settled her cheek against the synthetic stock of the rifle. The weld felt familiar, comforting. She took up the slack on the trigger. Exhale, pause, pull. The Mark 13 roared, bucking into her shoulder. The recoil was a harsh shove, bruising the already tender skin beneath her collarbone. Through the scope, she didn't see the bullet. She just saw the result. It wasn't a clean, heroic kill. The wind had shifted at the last second, a freak gust funneled by the valley walls. The heavy .300 Win mag round missed the gunner's chest and took off his right arm at the bicep. The man spun violently, dropping the machine gun, a mist of crimson spraying across the pale rocks. He fell backward, screaming, clutching the stump. Riley didn't celebrate. She didn't feel anything but a cold, clinical frustration. Sloppy. She grabbed the bolt handle, wrenched it up and pulled back. The spent brass casing ejected, flipping through the air and landing on her bare forearm. The searing hot metal burned her skin. She hissed, ignoring the pain, shoving the bolt forward to chamber a new round. Down below, Caldwell kicked the rear doors of the Striker open. Dismount, dismount, lay down, suppressing fire. He roared, dragging the injured private out into the blinding sunlight. The heat hit him like a physical blow. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber diesel and cordite. Dust choked his lungs. He dragged the soldier behind the massive tires of the Striker. "Where is it coming from?" Davis yelled, firing his M4 blindly up at the rocks. "Ridge 3 o'clock. Caldwell yelled back, drawing his sidearm. It felt pathetic in his hands. Suddenly a secondary explosion rocked the ground. An RPG slammed into the dirt 20 feet away, showering them in sharp gravel. Caldwell felt a piece of shrapnel slice across his cheek. He touched his face. His glove came away, wet and red. He looked up at the ridge. 2 more insurgents were standing up, leveling RPGs directly at the Striker. If they hit the armor from this angle, it would punch right through the passenger compartment. It was over. Caldwell braced himself. He closed his eyes. Crack! A sound entirely different from the enemy fire echoed through the valley. It wasn't the tearing canvas of the PKM or the hollow thump of the AKs. It was a singular, authoritative whip crack that seemed to split the sky in half. Caldwell opened his eyes. The insurgent on the left, the one about to pull the trigger on his RPG, simply ceased to exist as a threat. His head snapped back violently, a spray of pink matter painting the rock behind him. His body crumbled, folding in on itself like a dropped puppet. Crack. A second later, the second insurgent spun around, dropping his weapon, a massive hole punched through his chest plate. Caldwell stared. The enemy fire hesitated. The valley fell into a momentary stunned silence, broken only by the hiss of burning tires. He looked higher up the ridge, squinting through the dust and the glare of the brutal sun. "I'll be damned," Caldwell whispered, the blood from his cheek dripping onto his collar. Riley was breathing heavy now. The adrenaline was burning off, leaving a toxic sludge of fatigue in her veins. Her eye was watering so badly she could barely see the reticle. 2 down. She worked the bolt again. It felt stiff. Sand had blown into the action. She forced it forward, grinding the grit into the metal, locking the lug in place. The enemy had figured out where she was. The rocks around her hide site suddenly exploded into shrapnel. A burst from an AK-47 shattered the granite 2 feet from her head. A sharp, jagged piece of rock flew backward, slicing a 2-inch gash across her forehead. Blood immediately blinded her left eye. It was warm, sticky, and tasted like salt when it ran down into her mouth. "Fuck," she hissed, wiping the blood away with the back of her dirty glove, smearing it across her face. She didn't duck. She couldn't. If she broke contact now, the convoy would be overrun. Down below, she could see Caldwell's men moving. They were trying to set up a perimeter, dragging the wounded behind the remaining intact vehicles. They were sitting ducks. She found the muzzle flash that had nearly taken her head off. Range 600 yards, no wind correction needed. She fired. The recoil punched her. Through the scope, the shooter dropped behind the rock, outcropping his rifle, clattering down the scree slope. She worked the bolt. Clack, clack. The rhythmic sound was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her barrel was overheating. The mirage, the heat waves rising directly off her own rifle barrel, was distorting the optics. The crosshairs seemed to swim and dance. She had to aim instinctively, feeling the shot rather than calculating it. Down below, Caldwell was watching a miracle unfold. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the clean surgical strike they promised in the briefings. It was a brutal, desperate application of physics and violence. Every time an insurgent raised his head to fire on the convoy, a heavy caliber round slammed into the rock next to him or into him. The invisible shooter on the ridge was working with terrifying speed. Captain Caldwell grabbed Davis by the webbing of his vest. "Get the men moving. Suppress the lower ridge. The Ghost has the high ground we need to cover the flank." Davis, wide-eyed and pale, nodded frantically. He started shouting orders, kicking the lethargic, shell-shocked soldiers into action. The American rifles began to chatter, a disorganized but heavy volume of fire pushing the surviving insurgents back. Up on the mountain, Riley's world had shrunk to a circle of glass. Her shoulder was numb. Her cheek was raw from the recoil pad. The brass casings were piling up next to her, a small mountain of hot metal. She had fired 22 rounds in less than 4 minutes. She spotted a squad of 4 insurgents trying to flank the convoy through a dry riverbed. They were moving fast, heads down. Riley inhaled, tasting her own blood and the sharp sulphur of gunpowder. Crack. The lead runner tripped, his leg shattered at the knee. Crack. The second man caught a round in the shoulder, spinning into the dirt. The remaining 2 panicked. They broke cover, scrambling up the steep bank of the riverbed, trying to retreat. They had realized what was happening. This wasn't a fight they could win. They weren't fighting a squad. They were fighting an algorithm of death that didn't miss twice. Riley let them run. She was nearly out of ammunition in her current magazine, and she needed to conserve. She lowered the rifle, resting her forehead against the hot scope. She was shaking uncontrollably now. The come-down was hitting her, the sheer exhaustion. Her stomach cramped violently, and she dry-heaved into the dust, nothing coming up but bile and spit. She lay there for a long moment, listening. The heavy gunfire had stopped. Down in the valley, the crackle of burning diesel and the shouted orders of American soldiers echoed off the canyon walls. The ambush had broken. The enemy was retreating into the hills. Riley reached up with a trembling hand and pressed a gauze pad against the cut on her forehead. She looked down at the convoy. Through the optics, she found the man with the stars on his helmet. General Caldwell. He was standing in the open, bleeding from the face, looking directly up at her ridge. He couldn't see her. She knew her camouflage was flawless, but he was looking anyway. He didn't salute. He didn't wave. He just stared at the mountain, his posture, a mixture of shock and profound, humbling realization. Riley let out a breath that sounded like a dry laugh. "You're welcome, sir," she whispered to the empty air. She didn't feel heroic. She felt like she needed a shower, a stiff drink, and about 14 hours of sleep. Slowly, painfully, she began the arduous process of packing up her hide site. She gathered her hot brass, leaving no trace was part of the job. She crawled backward inch by agonizing inch, the gravel grinding against her chest plate, the blood drying tight and itchy on her face. The ghost was real. But she wasn't a phantom. She was flesh, bone, and exhaustion, and she still had a 3-mile hike to the extraction point. The sun dipped below the jagged spine of the Hindu Kush, and the temperature plummeted 20 degrees in as many minutes. The heat that had baked the valley floor all afternoon was gone, replaced by a biting high-altitude wind that cut right through Riley's sweat-soaked combat shirt. She was 2 miles from the hide site, 1 mile from the extraction point. Every step was a negotiation with her own anatomy. Her right knee popped with a sickening wet friction every time she bore weight on a downward slope. The Mark 13 sniper rifle slung across her chest had stopped feeling like a weapon hours ago. It was an anchor 15 pounds of precision steel and fiberglass, dragging her toward the dirt. The canvas sling dug into the raw, bruised meat of her collarbone. She paused, dropping to one knee behind a cluster of scrub brush. She reached up and pulled her PVS-15 night vision goggles down over her eyes. With a soft click, the world washed into a grainy, two-dimensional sea of green phosphor. She hated the tubes. They stripped the world of depth perception and peripheral vision, forcing her to view the hostile terrain through two toilet paper tubes. But they were the only thing keeping her from walking off a cliff or stumbling into a retreating insurgent patrol. She listened. The wind howled through the narrow rock chimneys, masking ambient noise. But underneath the gale, she felt the silence, the heavy, paranoid silence of the Afghan night. Her skin crawled. The adrenaline from the firefight had completely metabolized, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. Her brain was sluggish, firing on half-empty synapses. Just put one foot in front of the other. Hollins, she told herself. Don't think about the bed. Don't think about water. Just the next rock. Down in the valley, the aftermath of the ambush was a chaotic smear of infrared strobes and idling engines. General Caldwell sat on the lowered ramp of a surviving striker, a medic meticulously picking gravel out of his cheek with steel tweezers. The air smelled heavily of burnt rubber raw diesel and the iron tang of blood. "Sir, medevac is 2 minutes out," Captain Davis said, his voice hoarse. He looked terrible. His uniform was covered in chalky dust, and his hands were still shaking slightly as he held the radio handset. "We have 3 urgent surgicals, 5 routine." Caldwell didn't say anything at first. He just looked up at the northern ridge. It was a black, imposing wall against the starry sky. The ridge. Caldwell finally rasped. He winced as the medic dabbed iodine onto his torn cheek. "Did we send a team up there to secure it, to find the shooter?" "Negative, General." Davis replied, looking confused. JSOC liaison explicitly ordered all conventional forces to remain in the valley. They said their asset is self-extracting. We are to leave the AO immediately. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Self-extracting, alone, in the dark, after neutralizing an entire reinforced ambush element. He pushed the medic's hand away and stood up, his knees popping. "Captain, when we get back to Bagram, I want a meeting with whoever is running that program. No bureaucratic runarounds. I want a name." Up on the mountain, Riley heard the rhythmic, heavy thumping before she saw it. The low-frequency vibration of rotor blades chewing through the thin mountain air. She dragged herself over the final crest, her boots slipping on loose shale, and saw the designated LZ. It was nothing but a flat, wind-scoured plateau of dirt. She clicked her infrared laser, drawing a quick, invisible circle in the sky. A shadow detached itself from the darker clouds. An MH-60 Blackhawk flying entirely blacked out. It flared aggressively, the massive rotor wash, kicking up a blinding, choking cloud of dust and small rocks. Riley turned her back, squeezing her eyes shut, pulling her scarf over her nose as the grit pelted her like buckshot. The skids slammed onto the dirt. A crew chief leaned out the side door, his helmet visor down, and waved a frantic, gloved hand. She didn't run. She didn't have the energy to run. She trudged toward the mechanical beast, her legs feeling like lead pipes. She grabbed the edge of the floorboard and hauled herself up, falling onto the canvas jump seat. The crew chief didn't say a word. He just slapped her shoulder, racked the door shut, and the helicopter violently banked away, diving back into the blackness. Riley leaned her head against the vibrating bulkhead. The cabin smelled overwhelmingly of JP-8 jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. It was the most beautiful smell in the world. She unclipped her helmet, let it drop to the floor, and closed her eyes. The ghost was gone. Now she just had to survive the hangover. Forward. Operating Base Shank was a sprawling, ugly scar of HESCO barriers, plywood B-huts, and diesel generators. It was a place where sleep was a myth, constantly interrupted by the roar of outgoing artillery, the whine of drones, and the pervasive, inescapable smell of burning trash. When the Black Hawk touched down on the tarmac, Riley didn't wait for the rotors to stop spinning. She unbuckled, grabbed her rifle, and stepped out into the floodlights. The sudden transition from the hostile, lethal silence of the mountain to the blinding industrial noise of the FOB was jarring. It always made her feel slightly nauseous, like waking up from a deep sleep under freezing water. She bypassed the debriefing tents. She bypassed the armory. She walked directly to the Level 2 medical facility. The harsh fluorescent lights of the medical tent felt like a physical assault. The air was heavily air-conditioned and reeked of bleach and stale coffee. A young Navy corpsman, looking barely old enough to shave, looked up from a clipboard as she walked in. Riley stopped at the triage desk. She was a horrifying sight. Her face was streaked with dried blood that had caked into a dark crust over her left eye. Her uniform was torn at the elbows, coated in a thick layer of Korengal dust. She smelled like a wet, dirty animal. "I need a few stitches," Riley said. Her voice was a dry, hollow croak. She cleared her throat. "And some Motrin, a lot of Motrin." The corpsman blinked his eyes wide. He didn't ask for her ID. He didn't ask her unit. The JSOC patches, or lack thereof, told him enough to keep his mouth shut. "Yes, ma'am. Sit up here, please." He pointed to a stainless steel examination table. Riley climbed up her joints, screaming in protest. She unclipped her chest rig, letting the heavy ceramic plates clatter to the floor. The sudden absence of the weight made her feel lightheaded. As the corpsman began scrubbing the gash on her forehead with iodine, it burned terribly. She didn't flinch. She just stared at a water stain on the canvas ceiling. "Looks like a rock shard," the corpsman murmured, threading a curved needle. "You catch some spall, ma'am?" "Something like that," Riley said flatly. "You're lucky. Half an inch lower, and you'd be wearing a patch." He started to sew. The tugging sensation on her skin was strangely grounding. It proved she was still inside her body. "Convoy got hit hard out west today. Medevac brought in a bunch of guys from the 10th Mountain. Heard they got saved by some air support." Riley closed her eyes. "Yeah, good thing they had air support." Half a mile away in the Tactical Operations Center, General Caldwell was not resting. He had refused a cot and a change of clothes. He still wore his blood-stained uniform, the bandage on his cheek, bright white, against the dirt on his face. He stood in front of a folding table, glaring at a stocky, bearded man in a fleece jacket. "Commander Nash, the JSOC liaison. I don't care about your compartmentalization protocols." "Commander," Caldwell said, his voice dangerously low. The buzzing of the servers around them seemed to amplify his anger. "I had 50 men trapped in a kill zone. You put one shooter on that ridge? One. If they had missed, if they had been compromised, my men would have burned in those trucks." Nash didn't blink. He crossed his arms. "But they didn't miss, General, and your men didn't burn. My operator neutralized the primary threats, disrupted the enemy C2, and broke the ambush. Exactly as tasked. It's a reckless deployment of assets," Caldwell snapped. "It's a cowboy stunt. It's economy of force, sir." Nash replied, entirely unfazed by the stars on Caldwell's collar. "You didn't want us operating in your battle space. You said you had it handled. We put an overwatch element in place just in case your armor wasn't as invincible as you thought. You're welcome." Caldwell planted his hands on the table, leaning in. "I want to speak to the operator. I want to look the person who saved my life in the eye and find out why the hell command left them out there to hang." Nash sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Sir, with all due respect, my people don't do grip and grins. They do a job, they come back, they sleep, they do it again. I'm not asking for a photo op, Nash. I'm giving you a direct order. Where are they?" Nash stared at the general for a long, calculating moment. He realized Caldwell wasn't going to let this go. The general's worldview had been fractured today, and he was desperately trying to piece it back together. "She's in medical getting her face sewn back together," Nash finally said, dropping his voice. "Then she'll probably be at the showers. Bay 4. Caldwell froze. Nash gave a tight, humorless smile. "Like I said, General, economy of force." Riley stood under the showerhead for 20 minutes. The water was lukewarm and smelled faintly of rust and chlorine, but it felt like liquid heaven. She watched the water pooling around the drain turn brown, then pink, then clear. She scrubbed the dirt out of her hair until her scalp felt raw. She washed away the smell of the mountain, the smell of the gun oil, the smell of her own fear. But she couldn't wash away the vibration in her hands. They still trembled slightly, a stubborn neurological echo of the recoil and the adrenaline. She stepped out, drying off with a scratchy OD green towel. She pulled on a clean, oversized grey PT shirt and a pair of loose shorts. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror above the sink. The stitches on her forehead were stark and black. Her eyes were sunken, ringed with heavy, bruised shadows. She looked exactly like what she was, a 30-year-old woman who was aging in dog years. She walked out of the shower trailer, the cold night air hitting her wet hair, making her shiver. She just wanted to find her rack. She wanted to pull the scratchy wool blanket over her head and disappear for 14 hours. Instead, she saw a man waiting by the wooden steps of her hooch. General Caldwell stood awkwardly under the harsh yellow glare of the perimeter floodlights. He had finally washed his face, but he still wore his uniform trousers and a brown t-shirt. He looked smaller without his body armor, older. The lines on his face were deeply etched, carrying the weight of a command that had nearly ended in disaster a few hours prior. Riley stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps. She didn't snap to attention. She didn't salute. She just stood there, a wet towel draped over her shoulder, a waterproof shower sandal tapping rhythmically against the gravel. "General," she said flatly. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of a fact. Caldwell looked at her. He looked at the stitches on her forehead, the dark circles under her eyes, the sheer physical exhaustion radiating off her slender frame. He had spent his entire career commanding divisions, brigades, thousands of men, marching in synchronized formations. He had expected the Ghost to be a hulking, bearded giant, a comic book character. Instead, he was looking at a woman who looked like she could barely stand up, let alone alter the gravitational pull of a battlefield. "They told me you were female." Caldwell said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. He wasn't entirely sure how to navigate this. "I didn't believe them. I didn't believe any of it, actually. Before today." "With respect, sir," Riley said, shifting her weight to her good knee. "I'm really tired. Is this an official debrief, or did you just come down here to stare?" Her tone was abrasive. In any other context, with any other subordinate, Caldwell would have dressed her down instantly for insubordination. But out here, standing on the plywood boardwalk, the rank felt incredibly meaningless. "I came to say thank you," Caldwell said. The words felt clumsy in his mouth. "You pulled my ass out of the fire today. You saved a lot of young men who had no business surviving that ambush." Riley leaned against the wooden railing of the stairs. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a gracious, humble acceptance. "I did the math, General," she said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. "That's all it is. Distance, wind, elevation, and lead. I wasn't saving you. I was executing a target package. You just happened to be standing next to the targets." Caldwell frowned. "Don't sell it short. I saw what you did. I saw the volume of fire you put down. You held that ridge alone. Because I had to." Riley fired back, a flash of irritation breaking through her numbness. Because the brass people with stars on their collars, Sir decided that sending heavy armor through a known choke point during a weather blackout was a calculated risk. And the mitigation for that risk was leaving one shooter on a rock with no QRF, no extract plan, and 50 rounds of ammunition. She crossed her arms, ignoring the sharp pain in her bruised shoulder. You want to thank someone. Thank the engineers who designed the ballistic calculator. I'm just the idiot who pulled the trigger until her shoulder bled. Caldwell absorbed the anger. He didn't deflect it because he knew she was right. The tactical planning had been sloppy, arrogant, reliant on technology and luck rather than sound infantry doctrine. It was a bad call. Caldwell admitted. The confession hung heavy in the cold air. Generals rarely admitted fault, especially to enlisted personnel. I underestimated the enemy's EW capabilities. I underestimated the terrain, and I completely underestimated you. Riley looked at him, searching his face for the usual political doublespeak. She didn't find any. He just looked like a tired old man who had almost gotten his kids killed. The anger in her chest deflated, leaving behind the crushing weight of exhaustion. The valley funnels the wind, Riley said quietly, looking past him into the dark. Between 1400 and 1600 hours, the thermals shift aggressively. It creates a false mirage near the deck. If your element pushes through there again, tell your gunners to aim low. The heat distortion makes the targets look taller than they are. Caldwell nodded slowly, filing the tactical intelligence away. I'll tell them. And tell them to keep their spacing, she added, rubbing her forehead right below the bandages. If they bunch up again, one RPG will take out 3 vehicles. I can't shoot fast enough to stop a volley fire. You won't have to, Caldwell said firmly. I'm routing all future logistics convoys through the southern pass. It adds 4 hours, but it's open ground, no more valleys. Riley let out a slow, stuttering breath. Good. She turned and began to walk up the wooden steps. Chief, Caldwell called out, using her rank. She paused, looking back over her shoulder. For what it's worth. Caldwell said, I don't think you're a myth anymore, but I'm going to let the Taliban keep thinking you are. Riley stared at him for a long moment. A ghost of a smirk, cynical and tired, tugged at the corner of her mouth. Whatever keeps them awake at night, sir, she said softly. She opened the plywood door to her hooch, stepped inside and closed it, shutting out the glaring floodlights, the noise of the base and the weight of the war. Caldwell stood alone in the dark for a minute longer. He listened to the distant rhythmic thud of artillery in the distance. It didn't sound like a symphony of power anymore. It just sounded like a machine grinding up the earth. He turned and walked back toward the TOC, realizing that the most lethal weapon in his entire command theater was currently sleeping on a cot in a plywood box, hoping to God she didn't have to do it again tomorrow. The powdered eggs tasted like sulfur and wet cardboard. Riley chewed them mechanically, staring at the scarred laminate of the chow hall table. It was 0400 hours, 2 days after the Caldwell extract. The massive mess tent was mostly empty, filled only with the low, irritating hum of industrial refrigerators and the smell of industrial bleach trying to mask the scent of 1,000-man body odor. Her forehead throbbed. The skin around the black nylon stitches was a bruised, ugly yellow. Every time she blinked, the tight skin pulled. You looked like you headbutted a belt sander. Petty Officer First Class. Jack Miller dropped his tray across from her. He was her spotter, currently benched with a torn meniscus from a bad fast rope descent 3 weeks prior. He smelled like Irish spring soap and stale cigarette smoke. Good morning, Jack, Riley mumbled around a mouthful of awful eggs. Nash is looking for you, Miller said, tearing open a packet of off-brand hot sauce. Heard you made a friend out there, a general. I didn't make a friend, I did a job. Right. Well, rumor in the TOC is that Caldwell grounded the entire 3rd Brigade armor rotation. sent them back to the drawing board for counter-ambush drills. Brass in Bagram is pissed. He told a 2-star that driving MRAPs through the Korangal was, and I quote, a masturbatory exercise in logistics that only feeds the locals scrap metal. Riley paused, her plastic fork hovering over her tray. A tiny, genuine crack of a smile appeared on her chapped lips. He said that, on an open conference call, Miller grinned, dumping the hot sauce onto his hash browns. The man had a religious experience on that road, Hollins, and you're the patron saint. Shut up, Jack. She pushed the tray away. Her stomach was a hard, sour knot. The physical hangover of the mission was fading, replaced by the crushing, inevitable boredom of the phobie. War was 99% waiting for something terrible to happen, and 1% sheer terror. The transition between the two was what eroded the soul. Across the base in the plywood labyrinth of the Tactical Operations Center, General Caldwell was looking at a satellite topographical map. It was illuminated by the harsh blue glow of a projector. He held a styrofoam cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. His aide, Captain Davis, stood to the side, looking exhausted. They're shifting tactics. General Davis pointed to a cluster of red digital pins on the map concentrated north of the valley where the ambush had happened. Since the convoy hit, we haven't seen a single complex IED in the Western Corridor, but SIGINT picked up a surge in radio traffic in the high villages. Chatter. What kind of chatter? Caldwell asked, rubbing the bandage on his cheek. The cut was healing, but it itched fiercely. Nash, the JSOC liaison, stepped into the light of the projector. He didn't wear a uniform, just a tan tactical shirt and jeans. He looked grim. They're talking about the mountain that shoots, Nash said bluntly. Your ambush didn't just fail, General. It humiliated a local warlord named Tariq. He lost 14 men, 2 PKM teams, and face. In this valley, face is currency. Caldwell frowned. So he's regrouping. He's recruiting, Nash corrected. And he imported help. We have a confirmed whisper from an asset in Jalalabad. Tariq brought in a foreign fighter, Chechen, a specialist. Caldwell looked up from the map. A sniper, a counter-sniper, Nash clarified. He's not here to shoot your infantry, General. He's here to hunt my ghost. The TOC grew quiet. The servers hummed. Caldwell looked at the red pins, then at Nash. The memory of the invisible, violent grace that had saved his life flashed behind his eyes. You're not going to send her back out there, Caldwell said. It wasn't a question. It was a warning. She's already gearing up, Nash replied evenly. Tariq is holding a shura, a meeting at a compound in the upper ridges tomorrow night. He's rallying the local militias to launch a coordinated offensive on your fire bases. We have a narrow window to decapitate the network. She takes out Tariq, the coalition shatters. It's a trap, Nash. Caldwell snapped his voice, rising. They're baiting her. They know she operates alone in Overwatch. This Chechen is going to wait for her to set up her hide, and he's going to kill her. General. Nash said, his voice dropping to a cold, hard register. With respect to your rank, this is JSOC's battle space now. Chief Hollins knows the risks. It's her job to be better than the other guy. Caldwell stared at the map. The math. It was always about the math. But this time the equation felt unbalanced. He set his coffee cup down. It made a sharp plastic thud against the plywood table. Keep me on the net, Commander, Caldwell ordered. Nash raised an eyebrow. Sir, operational security. Keep me on the damn net. Caldwell repeated his voice, leaving no room for negotiation. If she goes blind out there, I want to know. The ruined Kalat sat on a jagged spur of rock, a crumbling mud brick fortress from the Soviet era. It smelled of pulverized clay, ancient goat dung, and the dry, dusty scent of decay. Riley lay on her stomach beneath the collapsed roof of the northern watchtower. She had been in position for 14 hours. Her body was a canvas of dull, throbbing aches. To avoid silhouetting herself against the sky, she had dug a shallow trench into the hard-packed dirt floor, burying her legs and lower torso. Only her shoulders and head were exposed, cloaked beneath a heavily textured ghillie blanket that perfectly mimicked the shadow of the fallen roof beams. She breathed through her nose, slow and shallow. The air was thin, freezing cold. Her right hand was wrapped loosely around the pistol grip of the Mark 13. Her trigger finger was entirely numb. Through the spotting scope, mounted low to the ground on a tiny tripod next to her rifle, she watched the compound 400 yards below. It was a fortified courtyard, surrounded by high mud walls. Heat signatures bloomed in her thermal optics. Men with AK-47s patrolling the perimeter. A fire burning in the center of the yard. She wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the shadows beyond the compound, the surrounding ridgelines. "Where are you?" She knew the Chechen was out there. Nash had briefed her. A hunter didn't look at the bait. A hunter looked at the other places a hunter would hide. She mapped the terrain in her mind. If she were hunting a sniper overlooking that compound, where would she sit? Elevation, defilade, a backdrop that swallows thermal bloom. She shifted her optics away from the target building and began scanning a jagged spine of rocks 300 yards to her left. It was a terrible place for her to shoot from, but a perfect place to shoot at her from. Nothing, just cold rock and scrub brush. "Overwatch, this is TOC." The radio cracked in her earpiece, the volume turned down so low it was barely a whisper against her eardrum. It was Nash. "Predator drone is picking up vehicles approaching the target compound from the north. 3 Hilux trucks. Target packages arriving." "Copy TOC." Riley breathed. She didn't move her jaw. Eyes on. Down in the valley, the heavy wooden gates of the compound swung open. The headlights of the Toyota trucks washed over the mud walls. Armed men poured out into the courtyard, forming a protective ring. Then Tariq stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was a tall man wearing a heavy wool paycole hat and a thick, dark coat. The thermal optic picked up the massive heat signature of his body against the cold night. Riley shifted her eye from the spotting scope to the rifle scope. Distance 412 yards. Wind dead calm in the valley, but a slight updraft at the muzzle. Elevation -22 degrees. It was an easy shot, a chip shot for a Tier 1 operator. She settled her cheek against the stock. The familiar cold fiberglass anchored her. She pushed the safety forward. Click. She put the illuminated crosshairs on Tariq's upper chest. Exhale. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The slack vanished. Suddenly, her peripheral vision, the sliver of the world outside the optic, caught a flash. Not a muzzle flash. A tiny, microscopic glint of ambient moonlight catching a piece of coated glass. It was coming from the jagged spine of rocks she had checked 10 minutes ago. Her brain processed the information in a fraction of a second. The Chechen hadn't been in position. He had been moving in the dark, waiting for Tariq to arrive, knowing the American sniper would have to focus on the target. He had waited for her to narrow her field of view. If she pulled the trigger and killed Tariq, the muzzle flash and the concussive dust signature of her rifle would give the Chechen exactly what he needed. A perfect stationary target. She would kill Tariq, and a half-second later, a 7.62 by 54 round would vaporize her skull. The math changed. Riley violently jerked the rifle to the left, ripping the crosshairs off the warlord and swinging the heavy barrel toward the rocks. The Chechen fired first. The sound was a supersonic crack that hit her eardrums like a physical blow. The bullet impacted the mud brick wall exactly 2 inches above her head. The kinetic energy shattered the ancient clay, exploding into a shower of high-velocity shrapnel. A chunk of rock the size of a golf ball slammed into Riley's right shoulder. She screamed, the sound muffled by her scarf as her collarbone snapped. The rifle dropped from her hands, the heavy barrel digging into the dirt. Pain, hot and blinding, flooded her nervous system. Her right arm went entirely dead, a useless piece of meat hanging off her torso. Down in the compound, Tariq's men heard the suppressed crack of the Chechen's rifle and the impact on the tower. They instantly realized what was happening. Tariq shouted orders, diving back into the truck. The courtyard erupted into chaos, heavy machine guns pointing wildly into the hills, searching for the shooter. Up in the ruined tower, Riley was suffocating in the dust. She rolled onto her back, frantically kicking her legs free of the shallow trench. Her right arm flopped uselessly against her side. Thwack! A second round tore through the remaining roof structure, burying itself deep into the dirt floor where her chest had been a second ago. He was walking his shots in. He had her pinned. Riley dragged herself backward, kicking with her boots, pushing with her good left arm. The dirt ground against her raw skin. She crawled behind a thick, load-bearing pillar of mud brick, pulling her legs in tight to her chest. She was hyperventilating. The pain in her shoulder was a screaming, jagged siren in her brain. She tasted copper, blood from a bitten tongue. She reached up with her left hand and fumbled for her radio. TOC Overwatch. She gasped, her voice ragged, panicked. The cool, clinical sniper was gone. I am hit. Repeat, I am hit. Enemy sniper has me pinned in the northern tower. Target Tariq is bugging out. Back at Bagram, the TOC went dead silent. Nash gripped the edge of his console. Overwatch status of injuries, Nash demanded. Right shoulder shattered, arm is useless, pinned behind cover. He's got the angle. Suddenly a new voice keyed the mic. A voice that wasn't supposed to be on the JSOC frequency. Chief Hollins, this is General Caldwell. Riley squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her head against the cold mud wall. General, tell them to drop a JDAM on that rock spine. Grid, air support is 15 minutes out, Chief. You don't have 15 minutes. Caldwell's voice was remarkably calm. It cut through the panic in her head like a surgical knife. Listen to me. The enemy is in the rocks. You are in a structure. He is trying to fix you in place so Tariq's men can flank you. Are they moving? Riley forced her eyes open. She peeked around the left side of the pillar. Down in the valley, 2 of the Hilux trucks were speeding up the winding dirt road toward her position. Yes, Riley choked out. Dismounts approaching, 5 minutes away. You have to shoot the sniper, Riley. Caldwell used her first name. It wasn't protocol. It was a lifeline. I can't mount the rifle, sir. Right arm is gone. Then shoot left-handed. Caldwell said, his voice hard, uncompromising. You know the math. Distance, wind elevation. The rifle doesn't care which shoulder it's pressed against. Stop bleeding, breathe, and kill the bastard. Riley lay in the dust. The smell of the ancient dirt was overpowering, dry and suffocating. She looked at her Mark 13. It was lying 2 feet away, covered in clay dust. Shoot left-handed. It was insane. The rifle was a heavy precision instrument. Her left eye wasn't her dominant eye. The bolt was on the right side, meaning she'd have to reach over the optic to cycle the action. It was clumsy, awkward, and slow, but Caldwell was right. She was going to die here if she didn't try. She took a breath. It rattled in her chest. She pushed through the blinding pain in her shoulder, visualizing the agony as a separate entity. A passenger in her body, not the driver. She reached out with her left hand, grabbed the hot canvas sling, and dragged the heavy rifle toward her. She didn't try to get back into the prone position. She couldn't. Instead, she sat up, pressing her back against the mud pillar. She rested the heavy fiberglass stock over her bent left knee, using her leg as a makeshift bipod. She tucked the butt plate awkwardly into her left shoulder. It felt completely wrong, like trying to write her name with her non-dominant hand while freezing cold. She squeezed her right eye shut and looked through the scope with her left. The optic was dirty, smeared with dust. The crosshairs danced wildly. Her knee was shaking. Thwack. A third round hit the edge of her mud pillar, showering her face in sharp grit. The Chechen was trying to chip away her cover. She ignored it. She focused on the jagged spine of rocks. 300 yards. She saw him. He was confident now. He had neutralized the American asset. He had shifted out of his deep cover to get a better angle on the ruin, preparing for the kill shot. She could see the dark shape of his head and shoulders nestled between two granite boulders. Riley thumbed the safety off with her left hand. She reached over the top of the optic, grabbing the bolt handle. She yanked it up and back, ejecting the unfired round that had been meant for Tariq. The brass clattered loudly against the mud floor. She shoved the bolt forward, chambering a fresh round. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps. "Stop bleeding. Breathe." Caldwell's voice echoed in her memory. She forced herself to stop. She let out a long, slow exhale. The shaking in her knee subsided for just a fraction of a second. The crosshairs settled on the dark shape between the rocks. Distance 310 yards. Wind still dead. Elevation level. She didn't have time to calculate the exact hold. She used the reticle, instinctively aiming dead center of the dark mass. She pulled the trigger with her left index finger. The rifle bucked violently. Because she didn't have her right hand to stabilize the forend, the muzzle flipped aggressively, hitting the dirt wall beside her. The recoil slammed into her left shoulder, jarring her broken right collarbone. She bit back a scream. Through the dust kicked up by her muzzle brake, she couldn't see the impact. She immediately reached over the scope, racked the bolt, chambered another round, and looked back through the glass. The dark shape between the rocks was gone. Instead, a body was draped backward over the granite boulder, a dark stain spreading across the grey stone. She stared at it for 10 seconds. The body didn't move. Riley let her head fall back against the mud pillar. The rifle slipped off her knee, crashing into the dirt. "Overwatch to TOC," she whispered. Her throat was completely dry. "Enemy sniper is down." In the TOC, a collective breath was released. Nash leaned back in his chair, wiping a hand across his forehead. Caldwell stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the radio console. "Tariq's men are pushing the hill." Nash barked to the room, the tensions snapping back. "We need extraction now. Where is that QRF?" "5 mics out," Davis replied. "Not fast enough," Caldwell growled. He keyed the mic again. "Chief Hollins, do you have eyes on the dismounts?" Riley looked down the hill. Through the jagged hole in the wall, she saw 30 men swarming up the rocky slope. They were 50 yards away. They were shouting, firing blindly into the ruins. "I see them," Riley said. She looked at her rifle buried in the dirt. She looked at her useless right arm. She drew her Sig Sauer sidearm with her left hand, resting it on her knee. 15 rounds of 9mm against 30 AK-47s. "I'm out of math, General," she said quietly. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact. She was making peace with the dirt. "Just keep your head down, Riley," Caldwell said. A shadow passed over the moon. The air pressure in the valley suddenly changed. A heavy, aggressive, rhythmic beating sound vibrated in Riley's teeth. 2 AH-64 Apache attack helicopters crested the southern ridge. They hadn't come from JSOC command. They had come from Caldwell's conventional brigade, flying dark, flying low. They didn't announce their presence. They simply opened up. The 30mm chain guns sounded like a giant jackhammer tearing up asphalt. The heavy explosive rounds impacted the hillside in a devastating linear wave of fire, earth and shrapnel. The Taliban dismounts didn't stand a chance. The slope dissolved into chaos, the Apaches looping and diving their thermal cameras, turning the night into a one-sided slaughter. Riley sat perfectly still, her back against the pillar. the deafening roar of the 30mm cannons shaking the ancient mud walls around her. Dust rained down on her head. "Target area is suppressed." An Apache pilot's voice crackled over the open net, cool and detached. "Dust-off is inbound." 10 minutes later, the HH-60 Pave Hawk medevac helicopter hovered over the ruins, lowering a rescue hoist. A para-rescueman rappelled down, crashing through the remaining roof structure. He found Riley sitting in the dirt, her face coated in a thick mask of pale clay, and dried blood, her left hand still gripping her pistol. "Chief Hollins," the PJ shouted over the rotor wash. She looked up at him. Her eyes were hollow, exhausted, completely drained of adrenaline. "Got a Motrin," she croaked. 48 hours later, Riley sat on the edge of a hospital bed in Bagram Air Base. Her right arm was strapped securely into a heavy canvas sling, her torso wrapped tightly in thick bandages. She smelled strongly of antiseptic soap and clean cotton. The door to the private room opened. General Caldwell walked in. He was in full uniform, crisp and pressed. The bandage on his cheek was gone, replaced by a dark, angry scar. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't bring a medal. He walked to the edge of the bed and looked down at her. "They're sending you to Landstuhl," Caldwell said. "Germany, surgery to pin the collarbone, then back to Coronado." "I know," Riley said, looking at her good left hand, flexing the fingers. "Tariq survived the Apache strike." Caldwell continued, his voice neutral. "He slipped over the border into Pakistan, but his coalition broke. The militias saw him run while his men got chewed up. He's a ghost now. We're all ghosts eventually, sir." Caldwell nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy piece of jagged metal. It was the piece of 7.62 spall that the surgeons had dug out of her shoulder. He set it on the metal bedside table. It landed with a dull clink. "I broke protocol calling in those Apaches," Caldwell said, looking at the piece of shrapnel. Nash was furious. "The Pentagon is going to have my ass in a sling for crossing operational boundaries." "Why did you do it?" Riley asked, looking up at him. Her eyes were tired, but the cynical edge was gone. "You did the math for me, Chief." Caldwell said, his voice dropping, devoid of any command authority. Just a man talking to a woman who had bled for him. It was my turn to balance the equation. He didn't salute her. A salute was too formal, too bound in the rules that they had both just broken to survive. He simply nodded, a deep, respectful inclination of his head, turned and walked out of the room, his boots echoing sharply down the linoleum hallway. Riley leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows. She picked up the jagged piece of metal with her left hand. It was cold. She closed her eyes, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, grateful for the first time in a very long time for the quiet. War doesn't hand out neat endings, and the math of survival always exacts a heavy toll. Riley and Caldwell both walked away, but the scars, visible and invisible, are the real currency of the battlefield. If this brutal, unfiltered dive into the reality of modern combat kept you hooked, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe for more raw, grounded stories of the operators living in the shadows, and share this video to keep their untold realities alive. Who do you think owed? Who by the end? Let me know in the comments.